6 corporate giant conglomerates control nearly 90% of all media Americans consume. And let's be honest, the paradigm pushed by these outlets fits into a box that marginalizes radical thought and third-party voices. And there are far too many instances of establishment reporters either getting fired or resigning for speaking out against the editorial line of their network, or for simply going against their advertisers. Like in 1999, when 2 Fox reporters named Jane Aker and Steve Wilson attempted to air a story about the dangers of genetically modified bovine growth hormone. And they were subsequently blocked from airing the report because of threats from Monsanto. And then there's NBC's Peter Arnett, who was immediately fired for making critical commentary about the Iraq War on Iraqi television. A memo from management made it very clear the reason was because he, quote, put a difficult face on the public for NBC in a time of war. Moving on to MSNBC's Phil Donahue, a news host who had a 29-year run on national TV. He was also fired because of his open criticism of the Iraq invasion. As Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Chris Hedges so aptly said, that moment was a time that commercial television decided amassing corporate money and providing entertainment was its central mission. And then there's a woman named Andrea Seabrook, a former NPR reporter on the Hill who resigned in protest of impartiality. She came on Breaking the Set to tell me how fed up she was with essentially reprinting government press releases. She actually called the incestuous relationship between reporters and politicians on the Hill collusion. And most recently, there's CBS News investigator Cheryl Atkinson, who resigned out of her contract early, citing that she was frustrated with the network's bias and pressure from its corporate partners. After the dissentee became viral, a former writer for the Democratic website Think Progress also wrote an article saying that he felt suffocating pressure reporting in D.C. and that his network would get berated with phone calls from the White House if he criticized the administration. This type of self-censorship is nothing new. It comes with the territory of working for any large media outlet funded by questionable entities. Except the difference with corporate media is that there are literally hundreds of conflicts of interest fueling their editorial lines. So we're here to go over a topic of censorship and truth in media. I'm joined now by investigative journalist and former CNN reporter Amber Lyon. Amazing to have you on, Amber.
Thank you, Abby, so much for having me. It's an honor.
So, Amber, you famously left CNN after working there for years, citing reasons of censorship. Can you talk about what happened with your documentary that you filmed in Bahrain for the network?
Yeah, we produced this documentary exposing that this Bahrain regime, the regime the United States had been supporting financially and with weapons, that this same regime was actually even using some of those weapons to torture and murder its people. And after we produced this documentary, we were told by CNN International that the documentary wasn't going to air. And we were given almost no explanation, Abby, as to why they chose not to air this documentary. And after further investigation, we found out that Bahrain was a paying customer at the network at CNN, that Bahrain and several other pro-United States regimes worldwide are actually paying CNN to produce positive content and fake documentaries about them, which I consider to be infomercials for dictators. And I think that CNN sprinkles this into their programming with little or no disclosure to viewers and their own journalists. And it's really defrauding viewers and really misleading people, Abby.
That is fascinating, Amber. What I find most interesting is that every time I talk about self-censorship to people like Piers Morgan or Bob Garfield on NPR, they are all shocked. They're like, what are you talking about? We never self-censor. I mean, do you think that this is a big issue in the press today?
It's a tremendously big issue, Abby. A lot of the muckraking journalists have actually had to leave the mainstream, including myself, because we just can't do our jobs on these networks because there is so much censorship. In 10 years of working in the mainstream, I was censored on stories at every single one of my jobs, whether that be to please corporate interests or the story was censored to please the United States government. So this is a chronic problem that's really destroying journalism in the United States, and people really need to understand when you're watching the mainstream media, you're not getting the accurate picture. A lot of the journalists have been turned into lapdogs versus watchdogs because that's what management wants.
Right. I mean, I was just mentioning 2 reporters that have basically said that they resigned because they were sick of reprinting government press releases. I mean, this is the way it works on the Hill here, Amber. I mean, as someone who's worked in the establishment media for so long, how would you say the editorial process works when people pitch stories they want to cover? I mean, do most journalists have that editorial freedom?
No, they don't. And I didn't have that when I was at CNN. And you're talking about that close, cozy relationship between Washington reporters and the U.S. government. While I was at CNN, I'd actually have other journalists at CNN write me and call me and ask me to amend my stories in favor of the U.S. government or government entities. They would call me on behalf of the U.S. government to change my stories, which I often refuse to do. But I mean, that's just the nature of what's going on there. A lot of these journalists have cozy relationships with authorities that are very questionable. They're doing more propaganda than they are actually investigative journalism. And two, there's a message sent from the top down to journalists in these newsrooms as to what's appropriate to cover and what's not. Case in point, the Occupy movement. Almost instantly when the Occupy movement started, management made it seem like it was an annoying movement, like viewers didn't want to see what was happening on the streets, like they were just some, hippies with no important message. And one executive at CNN, I was sitting down at dinner with him, actually told me that Occupy didn't deserve to be covered. And so when this is sent from the top down, this kind of message as to what you should be reporting on, it really influences what you end up seeing on the TV at the end of the day, Abby.